again, everyone, I'm Micaela and I'm a linguist. So I just want to start with some fun facts about sign languages in general, and then dive a bit more deeply into British Sign Language in particular. So, fun fact number one, sign language is not universal. It is unclear exactly how many sign languages exist in the world today. The latest statistic I could find that was reliable from 2013 was 137, but it is, there's probably something more like 300 now. What? Yeah, it's a lot of sign languages, but it's true. So the question I often get is, why can't everyone just use the same sign language? And this question makes me super angry because you wouldn't ask that about a spoken language. Well, actually people do, and we have tried to design global spoken languages. It doesn't usually go very well. But I think there's this common misconception about sign languages that they were somehow invented or that they're just mimed spoken languages. But this is not true. They are fully developed natural languages which just kind of evolve over time the same way as any other language does. And they, wherever you have deaf people, you get sign languages. And yeah, like I said, we did try to design a global spoken language with Esperanto. Didn't work out so well. We also did try to design a universal sign language in 1973. The World Federation of the Deaf came up with 1,500 signs and they called it Gestuno. But then when they tried to actually use it at a conference, no one understood it. So since then, it's been developed a bit more, and it's now called International Sign, but it's still, you know, pretty variable. They do use it at some international events, but no one can really agree on what it is. According to my BSL teacher, like 7 random countries in Eastern Europe use it, but like no one really wants to use it. So what you do get, though, I think, is kind of a lingua franca situation where, similar to how English is spoken widely internationally, I think a lot of deaf people from around the world will learn American Sign Language as well as their own native one so that they can communicate with people internationally. Fun fact number 2. Sign languages are not related to the spoken languages used in the same area. What? It's true. So there is no relationship necessarily between sign languages and spoken languages. For example, in the US and the UK and Ireland, we speak English, but American Sign Language and Irish Sign Language are derived from French, whereas British Sign Language is part of a totally unrelated family that also includes Australian and South African Sign Languages. So you'll find that American and Irish deaf people can communicate with one another, but they won't understand someone from the UK, and vice versa. And yeah, there is some borrowing between spoken languages and sign languages, obviously because they are in contact, and any language in contact, you know, you get borrowing and hybrids. And so I think the best example of a sign language borrowing from a spoken language is fingerspelling, where you can spell out a word by using the manual alphabet, which we'll talk about a bit more later. You also do get variation within one sign language. So with BSL, for example, Scottish users of BSL will have some signs that people in England won't understand, and vice versa. And that doesn't really correlate with the spoken language variation, but it's more to do with where certain deaf schools are located. So each school will have its own little twist on BSL. And you also get like hyper local signs, like in Manchester, where they have their own numbers that no one else can understand. And actually, anecdote time, I nearly failed my level 2 comprehension exam because the examiner was from Durham and they just have some wacky signs up north and I just didn't understand them. And but you also get kind of accents, I guess, like you can sign in a slightly different way. For example, I went to see a play at Shakespeare's Globe which had a BSL interpreter. And there were some signs that I was like, well, that's a bit dodgy. Like, what does that mean? And my teacher who was with me was like, oh, she's from Birmingham. So I think experienced signers can see like accents in other signers as well. So that's kind of cool. Very confusing. So here's a nice map. I could stare at this for hours, but I think the main things to point out are that the French sign language family is by far the most dominant, used in all of the Americas, most of Europe, Russia, West Africa, Southeast Asia. The UK is this tiny blue island, and you also have some blue in South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. And there's a couple other little families as well, like Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, and German. I hadn't noticed that one before. Yeah, so there's, you might get some, when these languages interact, they might borrow from one another. Obviously, they all change over time, but effectively, they're not mutually intelligible. Great, fun fact number 3. Signs are arbitrary. So just like not all words in spoken language are onomatopoeic, similarly, you can't always guess what the sign is going to be for a certain word. And so the question I often get in response to that fact is, wait, like why? I could tell you, okay, the sign for morning is this. And people will go, why is that the sign for morning? And this also annoys me because you wouldn't ask that of a spoken language. Like, why should the word for morning be morning in English? It doesn't sound like a sunrise or anything like that. So, language is arbitrary. But, some words in English do sound like their meaning. We do have onomatopoeia. And similarly, some signs are visually motivated, but most are not. Oh, for example, cat. That is a pretty easy one to guess. So now we can get onto BSL in particular. Every sign in BSL is made up of a number of different elements. One is hand shape. I think that this is best illustrated with an example. So let's look at the sign for flower, which is this. It has a hand shape, it has a location, and it has a movement. So if you just do any single one of those elements by itself, like this, it doesn't mean anything, right? You have to have all of them together. And you also have to sign within this square. So that's the signing space. There are exceptions, like the sign for ASDA, which I can't demonstrate on Zoom, but it basically involves patting your butt cheek. So like there's some exceptions, but usually you have to sign within this space. And direction of the movement is also important. So because it changes the meaning. So for example, this is I ask you and you ask me. So it's the exact same hand shape and location and movement, but opposite directions. And then we get some non-manual features added on top as well, which are mostly used to express emphasis, for example. So the sign for don't like is this, and then hate is like this. So it's the same, but with like an exaggerated facial expression. So some other important things to note is like BSL is not just replacing English words with gestures. There is such a thing called sign substituted English or sign supported English or SSE, which involves just kind of, using an English sentence, but replacing it with signs. This is really useful for people who aren't fluent in BSL. But it's not BSL. BSL has a different word order and syntax or grammar from English. For example, it has topic comment structure, which means you have to start by saying the topic, signing the shopping, and then commenting on it. So if I wanted to say I like food, I would say food I like. And relatedly, the preferred sign order is object, subject, verb. So food I like. Also, adjectives come after nouns. So delicious food would be food delicious. And time comes before the entire sentence. So that's kind of separate from the topic comment. So I would say yesterday, the food was delicious. And question words come at the end. So if I wanted to say, where's the food? I would say food, where? So it's quite different from English in all of those ways. And you can also use question words to convey information you already know. So like a rhetorical question. For example, if I want to say the food is in the kitchen, I would say food where? Kitchen. So it's kind of like a location marker there rather than an actual question. And you can also ask yes or no, not yes or no, either or questions by saying, for example, tea, coffee, which? So that's like, do you want tea or coffee? So you present all the options and then say which. So all quite different from English. Fingerspelling. This is the BSL alphabet. It's super useful because you can, it's kind of like a code and you can communicate with your friends using it in a noisy bar or, you know, on the tube, something like that. So just as you can spell out words in English if you're asked to, you could do the same in BSL. And I think names are probably the most finger-spelled words. So when you introduce yourself, you would spell out your name and then give your sign name if you have one, which we'll talk about later. But I would really encourage everyone to just Google this alphabet and learn it because, yeah, it's really fun. So BSL is used by about 145,000 people in the UK. And this is, it's got a pretty dark history. Until the 1940s, kids were punished for using it in school and they were forced to learn to read lips. And it was only recognized as an official language in 2003 in the UK. I want to talk a bit about the sociolinguistics as well. So we already talked about variation in terms of geography, but you also get differences in age. So older users and younger users will sign quite differently. What you don't get, which is different from spoken languages, is any social variation. So there doesn't seem to be like a prestige variant. There's no RP in English with sign language. So the variation just tends to be more regional and generational. Apparently, though, in the US, there is a Black ASL dialect, which is different from white ASL. And usually Black signers will be fluent in both, while white signers will only know their own, obviously. And there's no difference between the genders in BSL. So men and women will sign the same. But apparently there are differences in Irish Sign Language because traditionally boys and girls were educated separately in different Catholic schools. And so they did a study of 2 schools in Dublin and they found that the boys from St. Joseph's and the girls from St. Mary's left school, couldn't understand one another. So what ended up happening was the girls learned the boys' sign language, obviously. And religion, apparently, though, does lead to variation in BSL between Catholics and Protestants. So again, that was mostly because the Irish came over and taught at Catholic deaf schools in the UK. And so the BSL that Catholics use is quite heavily influenced by Irish Sign Language. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about deaf culture, just because this is something I didn't know anything about before I started studying BSL. There's a really cool deaf bar in Clerkenwell where the staff is all deaf, and you can order your drinks using BSL. They teach you how to sign a few drinks, and you can wear headphones for like a silent disco type thing, because you'll find that deaf people can actually enjoy music if the beat is quite loud. So if you go to a deaf bar, the music is so loud, you will in fact become deaf. But it's, it's really fun. And so I can't remember what the deaf bar is called, but it's above the blind restaurant. So I recommend going there if you can post-lockdown. And there's also a lot of discussion around terminology. So I thought I would clear some of that up. We apparently don't like the term hearing impaired because it focuses on an impairment. So the preferred terms are deaf or hard of hearing. And of course, deaf, mute, or deaf and dumb are never to be used because they're extremely offensive. There's also a difference between capital D deaf and lowercase d deaf, which is lowercase deaf just refers to the medical condition of hearing loss. Uppercase deaf means people who identify with deaf culture and use sign language and have kind of a shared identity. So when we talk about the deaf community, that would be using a capital D. Great, sign names. Sign names have to be given to you by a deaf person. You can't choose your own. So mine was given to me by my teacher, and it's this, and it's because I play with my hair all the time. Hair seems to be a big thing in sign names, or so it'll be something to do with your physical appearance, probably. And yeah, I just want to wrap up by saying that I've studied a lot of languages in my time, but BSL is by far the most fun. It just, obviously studying any foreign language kind of opens your eyes to another culture and people, but I think even more so with BSL, because I at least had never even met a deaf person. I didn't realize how inaccessible so many aspects of daily life in London are for people who are hard of hearing. So I think, and on top of that, the deaf community is just so fun and friendly and welcoming. When I was living in Dublin, I was out at a bar one night and I was pretty drunk, and I saw this big table of deaf people, like 30 people. Well, they were all signing. So I was like, oh, this is my chance. So I went over and I introduced myself and I was like, hi, I'm learning BSL. And then this one guy knew enough BSL to respond to me that they use ISL in Ireland. I was like, oh, that did not go as planned. But, you know, he knew enough because, like most deaf people, he knows bits of a lot of different sign languages. So he was able to sign me his name in the two-handed alphabet that BSL uses rather than the one-handed alphabet that ISL uses, and tell me it was his birthday. So that was quite fun. So yeah, I just highly recommend studying BSL if you can, or at least like watching some cool YouTube videos. There's a channel called Jessica Kelgren Fozard. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Some really interesting BSL videos out there, and, you know, learning fingerspelling, and yeah, it's just been a really good experience. So yeah, we can get to questions.
Thank you, that was great. Obviously the applause is happening. I mean, it does sound like I've just got a really noisy set of neighbours nearby who are having a slightly disruptive party. Thank you, that was marvellous. I'll give Evie a minute to scoot through the questions and pick a couple, but I had one myself, which was around the grammatical structure of BSL, and to what extent the grammatical forms are common across different languages or between different language families. The way that you described the language structure to me sounded very similar to some Asian languages in terms of verbs and tenses and word order. And I was wondering whether it was a common theme in terms of grammatical rules between different sign languages.
No, so all sign languages are completely different. So BSL happens to use object, subject, verb. They happen to put adjectives after the nouns. Other sign languages will do it completely differently. In spoken language as well, there's quite a lot of languages that, for example, where the adjectives follow the noun, even just lots of European languages, French, Italian, but English doesn't. And so similarly, like there's just as much variation across all the world's sign languages as there is in the world's spoken languages. Yeah.
And I can't remember the technical term that you used to describe it, but the way that society influences language development. Do you see the same patterns of patriarchy and gender in other cultures as well? Do the sort of hierarchies get reflected?
Yeah, definitely. Just like any other natural language, I think, it arises out of a need to find a way to communicate. And then, I think you still get the same. Again, it doesn't correlate. There's no, for example, I think a big part of spoken language, sociolinguistics, is social class variation, right? At least definitely in English in the UK. The way you speak, like your accent, is used.
I don't know what you mean.
And so I was fascinated when I found out that at least in BSL, that's not reflected. But there are other areas where it is, like we talked about gender and religion. And yeah.
Thank you. Evie, are you ready with some questions from the audience?
I am indeed. So in the questions, we've learned that apparently, sorry about this, but the sign never sets on the French Empire.
Clever.
And someone's also asking whether you will need to change your sign name if you cut your hair short. But let's go to the real questions. First one is, how do you sign big numbers in BSL?
So numbers, again, it depends on where you are. There's slightly different number systems in the north, especially in Manchester, like we talked about. But there's a similar way to how in English, we go up by, once we get to 100, we have another word for that, 100 and then 1,000. And so similarly in BSL, you start by signing 1, 2, 3, but eventually you'll say 100 or 1,000. So, there's a separate sign for that scale.
That is very interesting. Question from me is, oftentimes when you watch interpreters, they have very expressive facial expressions. And someone's also asking here to know more about this Libri reading. So is it done in parallel with signing, or do people focus on one or the other? And the expressiveness of the facial expression, does that vary across different languages?
So I'm not sure how non-manual features are used in other sign languages, but in BSL, it's a really important part. So the mouthing part is interesting. You can use mouthing either to distinguish meaning. For example, the signs for mother, Monday, March, month, they're all the same sign, which is the letter M. So the only way to distinguish it besides context is by mouthing the word as well. But mouthing is also used in different ways that don't have anything to do with like the English word. For example, to say fantastic, it's this. And you have to make this V shape with your mouth. Like it's just part of the sign, and like you just have to do it, and it has nothing to do with anything in English, right? So non-manual features are extremely important, and I'm not very good at them because I'm very low level BSL. But yeah, like you said, experienced signers and interpreters make a lot of use of that because I think it's a very visual medium. And it can really change the meaning, not just through emphasis, but it can also literally distinguish the meaning of two words.
You also mentioned that BSL does not have legal protection. What did you mean by that? Does that mean that if a deaf person comes to a public office, they don't need to have an interpreter there, or what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question that I should have researched more before this presentation. But I think what it means is that it doesn't have the same legal protections as other official spoken languages, at least. And I don't know what those protections are. That's a really good guess, that, because you do have to provide an interpreter in court, for example. If someone doesn't speak English, you have to provide, a French or an Italian interpreter. I don't know if you have to provide a BSL interpreter. I'm going to look that up and then put it in the chat or something.
A very, very current question is how has the deaf community suffered with the pandemic using Zoom and masks, especially?
Oh, I can't even imagine. So I think, yeah, one thing that I've noticed since I became aware of, BSL users at least, my teacher was telling me that she was on the tube and it got cancelled or it changed destination and there were announcements and everyone else in the carriage got up and left and she was like, what's happening? So I think that there's definitely a lot of things we don't think about, and that's similar with the current situation. You do get interpreters on whenever there's an announcement on the news, for example. They will often have an in-screen interpreter, but you also get captions. Speech recognition is not great. The technology isn't awesome right now. So I think, but these video call programs do have that capability. I don't know about Zoom, but I know on Google Hangouts you can switch on automatic captions. So I'm sure they're making use of that, but I don't think it's to the standard that they would need it to be. So I think it's probably a real struggle.
That's very interesting. Sorry about this. Are there stylistic variation of sign language that you would use in the same way as a typeface? So to reflect a purpose or a fashion trends?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I think there's probably different registers, if that's what you mean by style. So I think there would be a difference in how you sign if you're just chatting informally to a friend. Like I know my teacher would often sign with one hand if she was eating, which, I mean, BSL is definitely a two-handed language, which makes it really difficult to multitask. Although if you have like food in your mouth, you can still communicate, so that's cool. But yeah, so that would be like an informal chat. And then obviously if you're giving a presentation or you're an interpreter on the news, you would use a more formal register. And I think precision is one of the ways that we can see that style difference reflected. So if you're being very precise and signing within the sign space, compared with, just kind of signing like this.
Next question is, if I understand it correctly, signing of live events are usually interpreted, so not literal translations. Would someone chatting natively in BSL typically be more verbose?
More what, sorry?
Sorry. Would someone chatting natively in BSL, so not being interpreted, would be more verbose?
Oh,
flowery.
Yeah, I'd say so. I think with any simultaneous interpretation, you're losing some information. So I think, for example, if you're just having a chat and you're recounting a conversation you had with your friend, you would use something called role shift, which is where you play both parts of the conversation. So it's, instead of saying, and then I was like, and then he was like, you just kind of like change the direction of your body to be each person. And I think you would kind of lose that in an interpretation where you're just getting the gist of the message. Because I think what you see when you have an interpreter is obviously quite a lag between the original speech and then, because they have to process it first. And so, I mean, it's an amazing skill, because not only are they have to translate it in their head and change the word order around, like we talked about, to be a BSL sentence before they then convey it. So yeah, I think they're probably cutting a lot out, and that if you're using BSL natively, you'd be a lot more verbose. Sign, I don't know what the sign equivalent is for both.
Many of the Brits in the WhatsApp group are wondering, why is it that the French sign language is so dominant? Is that a socio-cultural, or is it just better?
Actually, that's quite interesting, because when this guy called Gallaudet went to the US to try and found a deaf school, he decided to come to Europe to learn how to educate deaf people. And he first came to the UK to study under some people here, but they refused to share their methods. So he went to France and he learned their sign language and took that to the US, because the UK was like, no.
So really, it's the dominance of the US rather than France.
Yeah, that's definitely how the pink family spread across the world, was via the US. But the reason French Sign Language went to the US in the first place is that the UK rejected this guy.
Well, there you go, guys. You have yourselves to blame, says the non-Brit here. Another question is, who invents new words? So Corona, how do you do Corona?
Yeah, actually, I was going to talk about that when we talked about the pandemic earlier, and I forgot. New words are kind of made up by native signers, the same way new words in English are. And of course, only once they get distributed widely enough in the community will they be kind of officially added. Not that there's any official BSL academy or dictionary or anything like that. It's just kind of when they reach a certain level of usage, then they're considered to be part of the language. But for scientific terms, I think it was last year, this student in Scotland invented over 100 new signs for terms like deoxyribonucleotide, because he was tired of fingerspelling them all during his degree. So he made some new signs, and those are now the official like scientific. So I should have looked up what COVID is actually. I mean, they probably just spell it, but yeah.
One for your next talk.
Yeah.
Are there things that you can really express only in sign language, or express better in signed language rather than spoken language? Someone is pointing out like concepts as a higgy.
Probably, because I think in spoken language as well, there's some concepts that some languages have a word for that's just spot on, and it takes 8 words to say it in English. I don't know of any examples off the top of my head, but given that it has the benefit of being such a visual medium of communication, I'm sure there's like a lot of expression that you could put into a concept that you wouldn't necessarily get in spoken language. Yeah.
There's a question if you could recommend any virtual or in-person classes that you would particularly recommend for people who want to try to learn BSL or get to start learning.
Definitely. I went to a school called Remark, which is in Farringdon. Obviously, I'm sure they're not doing classes at the moment. Maybe they've pivoted to online, but I would recommend starting by looking them up in case they're doing something, because they have really great teachers. And yeah, there's also a lot of YouTube tutorials on just basic BSL, greetings and like fingerspelling, and yeah.
And the last question that everyone has been waiting for is, we really want to see some rude words.
Oh my God.
BSL.
Oh no. Okay. Well, let me see. There are some.
Question is, would people swear does it bring the same level of relief to swear in the BSL as it does when you hit your elbow and you say that word, and it kind of makes everything better?
Good question. I would bet that when they stub their toe, deaf people would still make some kind of vocalization. But yeah, I mean, basically, like, this is a really useful sign. I could just be like, oh, fucking, like, fuck off, like, fuck, like, this is like, which is pretty satisfying. But one set of words I think is really fun and kind of rude is there are some words for countries that are a little bit outdated. I won't show you some of the more unacceptable, like, frankly racist ones, but there's some pretty funny ones, like Belgium and what else is there? Scotland. I think those are bagpipes. And there's France. What else? Greece. I don't know why that's not Italy, but it's Greece apparently. Yeah, so those are kind of fun. I mean, deaf people in general are pretty blunt. Like, they're super friendly, but especially when it comes to, like, physical appearance, they'll just tell it like it is.
Is there a gesture that we should avoid that we may not know that is, is there a danger of me making a random gesture and being really rude in British Sign Language?
Quite probably. I can't think of any, but there is the opposite, where, like, this is the number 2 in BSL, and I think a lot of English speakers would be like, well, in the UK at least, would be like, oh my God. But as my teacher explained, no, there's a difference between kind of doing it forward and doing it up, right? So, but I think a lot of times if you're just trying to sign, like, oh, 2 beers, please, people would be like, yeah, but just don't do this accidentally, basically.
Well, that's it for the questions. Thank you very much, Micaela.
Thank you.
Thank you, Evie. Thank you, Micaela. That was absolutely fantastic. I feel like we learned a lot. Nick has changed his image to people standing and giving you a standing ovation, but there's still no sound, Nick. This is a tech fail to go with all of our tech fails. So staying on brand. That was really wonderful. I really enjoyed that, and well done for learning.